introduction, I guess.
But by that time,
I think it was Tower of Babel, but if you put the N in front of it,
All right, good morning, everybody. We are very heavy on this side, and what's going on? Yes.
I have a praise report.
Okay.
Our daughter's pathology came back negative.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, are they gonna do any more tests, or is she good for now?
Good for now.
Awesome.
Fill up that greater ulcer.
Awesome. Well, that is definitely good news. I would say y'all are very excited too.
Very apprehensive prior to, very elated after.
Oh my. Well, another praise report. Dad made it good through his surgery. They did the bypass just fine. He's really wanting some peanut butter cups, but the doctor says he can't have it. But I know he lacks some self-control in that area, so he'll probably have some soon. But he said to say thank you for the prayers and checking on him. He's very, very happy. He just wants to get out of the hospital right now, but it will be a few days before he gets to go home. Other than that, I didn't get an update on Lance, but we'll probably get an update a little bit later on because they're coming in right now. But it is good to see everybody. We do have a couple of visitors today. We're glad you're with us. But let's ask Brother Rip if he would lead us in an opening prayer, and then we'll begin our lesson.
Let's pray. Dear God, our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the opportunity to come together as your people, Lord, to learn more of your will, to try to conform our lives, our minds, our actions more and more to what you have in store for us. Help us to reach that potential that you know. God, help us to focus, to block out the distractions of the outside world, and to really try to get closer to you and to each other as we go through this study together. God, we thank you for this blessing and this opportunity. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Does anybody need a book? We good? Okay. We are on page 55. And just like Josh said last week, apparently I'm trying out again. So we'll see how this works at the end of today. But we're starting today with, after David had spared Saul, we're introduced to a couple of new characters, one of which are going to be pivotal for the rest of David's life. But we're going to be talking about David and Nabal today. One of the funniest sermon introductions I ever heard. The sermon title was just, his name was Nabal. And he started out talking about some of the weirdest names. And it was funny, but the purpose is that names mean something. And whatever your name is, it might carry a reflection as to what your character is or who you really are. And it's good when you, so to speak, live up to your name. And as the commentator is going to say here in a moment, they're not sure whether or not Nabal was the real guy's name or if it's just a name that kind of emphasizes his character. I really think it emphasizes his character more than it is his actual name, but you can be the judge on that. But we'll start on page 55, read the introduction, then I'll make a couple of comments, and then we'll dive into our text.
Scripture emphasizes the importance of being hospitable. For example, Paul told the Romans that Christians should be given to hospitality, Romans 12:13, and Peter instructed his readers to be hospitable to one another without grumbling, 1 Peter 4:9. Importantly, hospitality should not be limited to one's friends, nor should it be extended only to those who can return the favor. We should do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith, Galatians 6:10. True hospitality is the opposite of stinginess, for it mirrors the love of God has shown to us, 1 John 3:17-18. Encouraging this kind of behavior, John wrote, "Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers, who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well." John 3 John 5-6. In our lesson text, David and his company of men requested help from a man named Nabal. According to the text, the man was very rich. 1 Samuel 25:2. This means Nabal was more than able to extend hospitality to David and his followers. Nevertheless, he refused to offer any assistance to them. Instead, Nabal responded, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed from my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from?" Nabal's refusal to help is deplorable, especially when we consider he and David were from the same tribe, Judah, and that David and his men protected Nabal's shepherds and flocks while they were in Carmel. Nabal's arrogant refusal of David's request was noticed by his servants, who feared retribution. One of the young men reported the matter to Abigail, Nabal's wife. After telling her why David and his men deserved assistance, 1 Samuel 25:15-16, he said of Nabal, "For he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him." In response, Abigail made provisions to feed and care for David and his men. Nabal was stingy and foolish. Abigail was gracious and hospitable.
Okay, I want you to think about the word hospitable for a moment, and there might be two words you see, but there's one really big word that makes up hospitable, or hospitality. Hospital. Yeah, hospital. How can we be a hospital and not be in a hospital while we're here on earth? Well, the idea is how can we serve the needs of those who don't even realize that they need something? Or even if someone is in need of something, can they really come to us and we can, so to speak, tend to their needs? This lesson's really going to emphasize the way in which Jesus cared and showed compassion to those who were less fortunate, and gave them what they absolutely needed. And we too need that same kind of character, depending on what we do have, of course. But I think just like Peter and John at the gate called Beautiful and the lame man, "Silver and gold have I none, but that which I have I give you." If we develop that kind of attitude, we might be more of the character which God wants us to be. And sometimes that's a little difficult. We're a lot more prone to give people that we know things because we know their character, we know whether or not we can trust them. But then what about a complete stranger? Well, it's interesting because sometimes they might abuse what we give them. Sometimes they might have a genuine need, and we fulfill that need, and we could be doing a good service that way. But what we're going to find here this morning is some of the more, practical warnings at times of what happens if we have this world's need or this world's goods, and we see a brother who has a need, and then we shut up our hearts. That's not a good character at all. So we're going to see why we shouldn't be like Nabal, but just because Nabal was able, we should not be like Nabal. That's a lot of Abels in there. But we're going to see some characteristics that we should be and that we should not be, especially in regards to hospitality. I thought it's interesting as well, the word spit is in there. I was like, how does that work in there? Well, the only thing I can really think of is when the blind man came to Jesus, and he said, "Help me," and he spit on the ground, and he put the clay in his eyes, and he said, "What do you see?" "Well, I see men as if they're trees," and he cleans it again and cleans his vision. I think it's that idea of not necessarily putting down people, but it's the idea of almost, you know how in medical terms they would have the word salve, S-A-L-V-E, is this idea of medicinal type thing. And when you look at the church of Laodicea, it brings up that same idea that to my eye, you are displeasing to me. But you should be pleasing. In fact, you should be like this healing property. And we're going to see that kind of character as well. Someone who shut up their goods to a person who genuinely needed it, and someone who God abhorred, and they were disgusting in his eyes. So we'll see both words kind of played out a little bit. But if you have your Bible open, or if you don't, open it up to 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25, we'll read the text, and then we'll go through the sections piece by piece. And I'll give you a little bit of a geography lesson after we go through this first section here in a moment, because it almost seems like they're somewhere familiar, but it's not the place we think it is. 1 Samuel 25, beginning in verse 2. It would say, "Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. And the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. She was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. When David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, 'Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity, Peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the while that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David.' So when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all the words in the name of David, and waited."
Sharing his sheep in Carmel. Calls the name Carmel means vineyard land or garden spot. It's possible the text is emphasizing the difference between David's situation in the desert and the situation the rich man enjoyed. Regardless, the rich man did not have to spend his energy searching for food, but was instead able to shear his sheep. According to Paul, this activity was traditionally celebrated by feasting with the nun and his faith. Having described the man in his vast wealth, the text reveals his name, Nabal. Regarding his name, find observe. The name Nabal means fool in Hebrew, a meaning that well fits his character in the following story, since it is unlikely that anyone would give their child a name with such despairing meaning. Some scholars believe that his original name had been displaced from a misappropriate symbolic name. Whether that is the case or not, Nabal was vastly different than his mom, Abigail. Introducing her, 1 Samuel 25:3 states, "And she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his doing." One final detail was given that has bearing on all problems. Nabal was of the house of Caleb. In other words, he and David were pulled from the same tribe. Upon hearing that David was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men. David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name." It's possible David expected Nabal to react favorably to his name. David, because he was well known when he slew the Philistine giant Goliath. This, however, was not the purpose of their visit. The young men were not merely visiting Nabal to make him aware of David's whereabouts. They were to ask the rich man for provisions. So David charged, "And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity, Peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them. Nor was there anything missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. Ask you young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes. When we come on a feast day, please give whatever comes to your hand and to your servants, and to your son David." David and his men needed help, because they had protected without taking from his herd, literally from his servant. Jesus explained, to his credit, David refuses to become abandoned in God's abilities. Instead, he offers his services, as it were, expecting to be rewarded for providing protection. And he is in the power to simply take what he wants. From his perspective, his actions are deserving of favor, and Abel's response is deserving of death.
Okay, a couple of different ideas. It makes mention from the beginning, the desert of Paran. If you look back in chapter 24 and you follow the narrative of the life of David, just the beginning of chapter 24, let's go 23. That's not far enough. 23 and verse 14. This is after David flees and he's trying to get away from Saul. David stayed in the strongholds of the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. We'll talk about where that is here in a moment. Look over towards the end of 23, verse 24 and 25. So they arose and went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, where we are in this text, in the plain on the south of Jehimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him, and they told David. Therefore he went down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Now, if you look at a Bible map, this is south of Jerusalem. There we go. You see the Dead Sea. Sorry, those sitting there. The Dead Sea is off here to the right. But as you go south, you can see Bethlehem. So this is southeast of Jerusalem. Keep on coming down. We're looking at about 50-ish miles south of Jerusalem is Maon. Now, up above Maon is this Carmel that we read about in the beginning of the chapter. This is not the Carmel that's way up here where Elijah had his showdown with the prophets of Baal. It's a different place. In fact, Mount Carmel is known as being this region that stands above the rest. This Carmel is not quite like that. In fact, when you look at this lay of land, it talks about shepherds. They would call this the Bedouin. These are people who made their living off of animals, livestock. It's just a fancy way of calling them Aramaic shepherds. The hillsides through here, the terrain is ridiculous. So you would have mountain goats all over the place, camels all over the place, sheep all over the place, and it seems like, well, you can't have sheep without grass. Well, there are small pockets where sheep could graze for a while, and there would be several places where it would be like green, luscious green. I think that's actually in the next slide here. Just little patches here and there. But it wouldn't be uncommon for ranchers to buy out these lands, use it for their flocks, and then whenever they were done with it, they'd give it to another individual, and they would take care of it and tend to the land. But they had a really good system. Depending on what the season was, they wouldn't just keep them on one plot. They'd rotate them. And especially in regards to where we are location-wise for Jerusalem, or the land of Judah, the wilderness of Paran is this whole area down here. And if you see, there's green flat plains through here, and then you've got mountainous regions through here. So this whole thing, it's kind of hit or miss if you're going to see a valley or a hill or a cave. Plains, very scarce to come by. But whoever Nabal is, the text is correct, at least the commentator, by saying this was a very rich man, so rich that, in fact, he was able, he had 3,000 sheep. 3,000 sheep, verse 2, and 1,000 goats. And he wasn't shearing his camels, but he was shearing sheep in Carmel. So that's just kind of a minor illustration. Now, just kind of something to think about for the life of David. When you think through the Psalms, and he talks about God as his rock, as his shelter, as his refuge, as one who leads him, who guides him through the wilderness. His enemies are pursuing him, and God kind of presents this green table in the midst of his enemies, which I find that very ironic. It's all due to his experiences. And I think sometimes we tend to forget to relate to God in the sense of our experiences. And God does understand what we're going through. And sometimes we kind of distance God from what we're experiencing in life. We shouldn't do that. Even though we're not necessarily shepherds or cart builders or quarry men, stone quarries, it doesn't mean we can't look around us and use the things that we're accustomed to and find a relationship between us and God and what we're doing. There is a relationship there. And I think that's one of the beauties of the creativity of David, and that God shows, look, in your mind, you can relate to God, just like David did. However, in this case, we're going to find a man who had no relation with God, but he did kind of have a relationship with Saul, as we're going to see here in a moment. Now, that's just a little bit of the lay of the land lessons I can learn from that. Nabal's not a cool dude. And it makes me wonder, when David makes this request, do you think that he's justified in making this request, or do you think he's just this young snob who's trying to get something?
Well, if we believe in Galatians 6:10, as Christians, it wouldn't be correct. We shouldn't give expecting something in return. I don't know what the custom is back in those days of tribes and people, but if his men were thirsty and hungry, it would be Nabal should have fed them no matter what happened. But so it's kind of twofold. I think the commentary seemed to think that David thought he was owed something, which is different from our Christian. We should never help somebody expecting something in return. We do it out of love from our heart. So it's kind of a different type of scenario here than what we have today in New Testament Christianity.
Okay, look, yes.
Wasn't this kind of on the outer frontier, I guess you'd say, which at that point, anybody that wanted to take something could just, if you had the power, you could take something. And David seemed to be the, I guess maybe the law and order of that area, and it afforded protection to them. They didn't lose any of their animals or any of the, there was no attack on any of the shepherds, which I'm sure were very adept at defending, his men, trying to take what they want. And so, I'm sure Saul didn't have a garrison out here to protect him, so really, David would be due some for I guess keeping law and order and I guess keeping them safe. Okay, so interesting ideas. Let me point out something. So the purpose of the law, at least according to Deuteronomy 32, would say the purpose of the law is to protect God's people. It's supposed to be able to provide for those who are less fortunate. In regards to a farmer, you would leave the corners of the field unreaped so that those less fortunate, or if they were traveling by, could grab something. Is nice. But it says in verse, 8, it was a feast day. This was a very rich man. How much preparation do you think a rich man would have to make if it was a feast day, which means he has to give a sacrifice to God of his goods, and a reasonable sacrifice to God in accordance to what he has? Now, granted, there are some offerings that had to be given, but I like to think more of a free will offering in this case. What happens if it's a feast day and someone comes to you and says, look, we've protected your men, it's a feast day, we've come to worship God, but we find ourselves low on goods. Can you help us with our goods? Could this be said that maybe this could be a situation of not necessarily a hindrance from going to worship God, but an ox in the ditch? So, can someone explain what I mean by that?
You have to do something about it. If your ox is in the ditch, you don't just leave it because it's the Lord's day. Same thing about this feast. He's supposed to have one anyway.
So, which is more important, giving God sacrifices, or is it the heart who's willing to help others in need? What is God more interested in this scenario?
It'd be the same as when Jesus told them, that when they took wheat out of the field, so it's not what goes into the man, but what comes out. He said, there's something behind the laws that are given. There's an intent. I think it would be worse to offer a really good sacrifice and then treat your brethren poorly.
So think about the lawyer in Luke 10. Comes to Jesus, says, Lord, what do I need to do? Well, what does the law say? Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. It would say later in the text, willing to justify himself, he asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And he gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, there was a priest, there was a Levite, which implies this is someone who's not religious in God's eyes, but they're a religious-minded individual. So they're not accepted by God. But anyways, these are people who should have compassion and want to help this individual, regardless of what they had or did not have. And instead, this Samaritan walks in, who the people would say, well, they don't care for anybody. And he went above and beyond more than I think sometimes we may, even looking at ourselves, would say, I probably wouldn't have helped him that much. I think in this case, Nabal, because of how rich he was, and I tend to compare this with Job a little bit, I think he had more than enough to be able to tend to them if he really wanted to. And in regards to David, we're going to find out here in a moment that he's just listening and accepting everything that he hears, and he's not testing it. Abigail does, but Nabal does not. I think in this case what David is saying is, look, if there was another way, I would do it. But it's a feast day, you have more than enough. Can you help us? We want to help you, or we have helped you in the past. And I don't know. I don't know. I think there is some validity. Maybe David did have the attitude of, look, you owe me something, and we shouldn't have that attitude at all. But then when I look at the character of David, he was a man after God's own heart. I don't know if he was saying it as, I'm due this, which it could be a worker who's worthy of his pay him. But I think it was because of the nature of the law taking care of those less fortunate. And the fortune that Nabal had, especially on a feast day, I think he had more than enough, and he could have helped them. But instead, he chose foolishly. Those are my thoughts.
Well, could it be that the money, he worshiped the money more than he did the law?
That's possible. That's possible. He had the wrong love. Which that's actually what Paul was telling Timothy in 1 Timothy 6. Teach those who are rich in this world not to be high-minded, nor to trust in vain riches. Because just like eagle's wings, you get them and they're gone. That seems to be the case of money. But even with a lot of rich people, they have more than enough, but then just they're more about how much they can get and gain rather than give, have gratitude, and give to those less fortunate. Do you have another comment? Oh, okay, keep going. Okay. We'll do that. So I think this is an interesting concept to think about, and I think we kind of missed the point of the feast day a little bit, but there are some questions that arise from the text. Let's begin in verse 10. We'll look at the next section here in a little bit, Nabal's rejection. So David's made the plea, he's waiting for the response, and now we get it. Verse 10. Then Nabal answered David's servants and said, Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away, each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shears and give it to men whom I do not know where they are from? So David's young men turned on their heels and went back. And they came and told him all these words. Then David said to his men, Every man gird on his sword. So every man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies.
Rather than responding with brotherly kindness to the request of their men, Nabal was harsh and condescending. He began, Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away from each one from his master. The rich man was unimpressed by David, and then those who came to him on for him. This is not me, Nabal, not known David, for his words declared otherwise. If anything, his reference to David as the son of Jesse echoed the derogatory language used by King Saul. This is also made clear by his reference to servants nowadays who break away from each one from his own master. For of want to be those servants or broken away from the masters these days. But Nabal was full of sorrow not, who was serving more to himself as his subsequent response to David's been revealed. Refusing to give him provisions, he continued, "Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat I have killed for my shearers to give it to them when I do not know where they will find?" Concerning this response of love joke, Abel is even unwilling to give to David the bread and water, the most basic food and drink, much less the meat he had slaughtered for his workers. Abel telegraphs his egotism in the original language of verse 11 to Jesus' I and mine, he told him 8 times, 4 times apiece. I take, I slaughter, I give, I know, my bread, my water, my meat, my shares. With their request denied, David jumped in and turned on the fields way better. They came and told him all this work. Not surprisingly, David was offended. The response to his request again to prepare for life.
Is it wrong to make a decision whenever you hear something? Well, hold on. Is it wrong to form judgments as you listen to someone's plea or request? By that, I mean, can you think while someone's speaking to you and be a little bit skeptical? Yeah, you have that right. You have that right. In Nabal's case, there's a couple of things that I find a lot of immature on his part. With a man who has acquired this kind of riches, especially regarding the character of Abigail, who's definitely a virtuous woman, if there ever was one, it took a long time for him to get this, so I'm really thinking he's up there in years. And I'm thinking he's up to the point where he can make good judgments based upon weighing what evidence is given, and if there isn't enough, asking for more evidence. It's almost like Judah and Tamar. When Judah exclaimed to Tamar, "Well, you're just that harlot." No. And she had taken his staff for surety, so that whenever he blamed her for having a relationship with her, the reason she did it is because Judah didn't provide the heir like he promised to give to her, and there was an issue. Well, it's kind of the same thing here, except Nabal doesn't even ask for evidence. He immediately just shuts that down and says, well, news is that anybody could be David. And really, there's plenty of servants running around nowadays, so and he doesn't even say, give me proof that you're not one of them. I think David would have understood that easy. But instead, he just went to radical thinking and didn't even question it or test it. I think there's an issue with that. Now, again, being skeptical is not a problem. But if we're going to make wise and godly choices based upon whatever issues we may find ourselves facing, you've got to weigh the options and be honest with both sides. And if it does give the appearance that it is wrong, a joke, or it's fake, then you have every right to say, no, I'm not going to do this, and these are my reasons why. Any thoughts on that? No? Okay, so now we'll get to a more pleasing side of the story. David's up in arms. He's about to go kill the entire house of Nabal. Yes?
On this section, was he really insulting David when he said, I didn't know where you're from? Of course, he knew David well, and called him the son of Jesse. But, isn't it kind of an insult to say, I'm not even sure, basically, you're the son of Jesse or where you come from? Or, it seemed like that's kind of an insult to even his heritage,
It could be, because it's almost like saying, does he even have a father named Jesse? Which, again, I'm
doesn't even know his father,
Yeah.
something like that, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking because of how close they were, he's only from Bethlehem. And surely, if he knew about Saul, or does he? Yeah, he should know about Saul. He's his king.
Well, he knew who he was. He knew he was the son of Jesse. But in a way, it's just more of an insult to David, I think, the way he said it.
Okay, I could see that. Because his fame of slaying Goliath,
Yeah.
everybody would know about it.
So he was just definitely trying to just insulting in his family.
Okay, I'm not going to make comments on that. That's a good point. Was it you insult family, them are fighting words? Is that right? Yeah.
Who's your dad?
Yeah. That's exactly what Nabal said. It's like, hey. Oh my. Oh my, that's funny. Okay, so Abigail intercedes. It's a good comment. Beginning in verse 14, it would say, "Now one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, 'Look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them. When we were in the fields, they were a wall to us both by night and day, all the time we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what you will do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him.' Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And she said to her servants, 'Go on before me. See, I am coming to you.' But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And so it was, as she rode on the donkey, that she went down under cover of the hill, and there were David and his men coming down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, 'Surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him. And he has repaid me evil for good. May God do so and more also to the enemies of David, if I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning light.'"
Nabal's conversation with David's men was not private. Consequently, one of his own servants broke away from the master and reported the matter to Abigail. He said, "Look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them. When we were in the field, they were a wall to us both by day and by night. And the time we were with them keeping the sheep." The servant evidently acted for 2 reasons. First, he believed David and his men to be worthy of support because of what they had done for Nabal's shepherds. Importantly, his testimony verified the claims David's young men made of Nabal. Bergen noted, "From these details, David, the good shepherd of sheep, is shown to be vigilant shepherd of shepherds also. Even as he formerly protected his flocks from marauders, so now he protected keepers of flocks from marauders." The image presented here is that of a leader who is demonstratively fit to shepherd the Lord's people. Second, the servant appealed to Abigail because he feared retribution from David's army. Stating this, he declared, "Now therefore, know and consider what you will do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his household. For he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him." In other words, Abigail was her household's only hope. If she intervened, David's wrath might subside. If not, trouble would certainly come. The term scoundrel, used by the servant to describe Nabal, is also translated as worthless man or wicked man. His point was simple. Nabal could not be reasoned with. Therefore, it was necessary to approach Abigail. After hearing the servant's report, Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. All this was done without Nabal's knowledge. The provisions were taken to David and his men. Although David was planning to attack Nabal's household, Abigail's efforts kept that from happening.
In regards to finishing the narrative, because there's actually quite some cool things that pop up from this. One, clarity as to what exactly David did. It's not just a one-time occurrence, but apparently for however long they were going shepherding, which for full-time, that's their work, shepherds, they'd be out there for anywhere from 4 to 7 months, depending on the region. So they were out there a long time. And David, the servant would even say night and day, verse 16, while we were with them keeping the sheep, they protected us. And they didn't ask anything of us. It's because they were trying to protect the vulnerable. And now in regards to here, David said, look, this is what we did. Can you repay the favor? If it weren't the case, then I wouldn't ask for it. Abigail, when you look at some of the extra stuff that they had plenty. And they probably still had more than enough to be able to give to God on the feast day. And even if it was less than what Nabal and Abigail, or maybe even Nabal didn't intend on doing anything on the feast day, and Abigail did, I don't know. They would, even though it would have been less, it still would have been a pleasing sacrifice to God because it was what they had intended, just some of it kind of got detoured. It's kind of the same way with the widow with 2 mites. She gave in all that she had. Well, if you're helping out someone and you don't have as much as what you normally would give, and don't just think giving in the sense of just money, time, other resources, your mind, or just company. There are lots of ways in which you can give to other people that you intended to give to someone else. And even in regards to God, Jesus would make it very clear in Matthew 25. Look, when you're helping these people, don't feel like you're robbing me. You're helping me because as you saw them have need, you were helping me. I think that's an interesting concept and something to take away from this. Looking at a bigger picture, Peter would write that sometimes a spouse could be won over by the character or the reputation of their mate. I think this is interesting because you have a wife going on behalf of one who holds the sword and saying, please don't do this. This is a man of misunderstanding. He's obviously hard-headed, but please spare mercy, give mercy. In this case, we will find later in the story next week, Nabal did die, more than likely of a heart attack, but David didn't harm him. But it makes me wonder how often, whether it's a husband or wife, goes to bat before God on behalf of the other and say, God, spare mercy on them, help me to help them. I think if we did exactly what Abigail did, I mean, you don't have to bring God 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 500 sheep already dressed, 5 sealers. You can put whatever you want in that. It could be how much time you spent into it, how much family relations you had to build, or how much time you prayed for them, or whatnot. The idea is who's going to intercede for your spouse if your spouse needs help. And you know that if something doesn't change, that the vengeance of God is going to be on them. I'm not saying God forgive them of their sin, but God open up a possibility that their eyes can be opened, that they can become a better individual. I think that's also another lesson that we find from this, that spouses have powerful influence over the other, even if their spouse is not righteous. There's a powerful influence that can come about that. And I think sometimes we become discouraged, especially in relationships where the other spouse is not a Christian and they went ahead and married because just it seemed to work for them. But because you bought a garden that's got some thorns and weeds in it, and you can make it good for God. And even sometimes we might find in this case, even interceding to the master, so to speak, may not necessarily save your spouse, but God does take note of it. And in the very end, where David and Abigail get married, sometimes you might just be doing what you need to do. And regardless of what you did, it's not going to matter because, well, no, it does matter. Let me rephrase. It doesn't necessarily matter to them because they did not change. In fact, it did the complete opposite. They continued hardening their heart and being who they shouldn't be. So I think there's a beauty here. And I think even as if we go to bat and trying to, from David's perspective, some people might anger us to the point to where we want vengeance, so to speak. But let's always remember that we have a Savior who said, remember what I did for you. Remember what you did. Remember how you were forgiven. Can you spare mercy on them? Try to find a way to save them. Jesus does the same thing to us towards those who are wicked and ungodly. And again, it's stated every week, long-suffering of the Lord is salvation. We can act accordingly. So there's a couple of cool parallels that we can pull from this. Any thoughts or comments?
I thought it was kind of funny that the shepherd came to his wife and said he's a scoundrel, and she didn't even argue. she knew him well. You know?
Well, sometimes things aren't recorded.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. But, you know, I was just thinking, David had something in mind that he would have regretted doing if it hadn't been for Abigail. He would have really regretted it from what you read. And she saved him from doing something that he would have, I guess, regretted later.
When you look at verse 25, which is next week's text, she does say, don't destroy the entire household for his folly. Which kind of brings up an interesting study when you look at then what happened with Egypt if it was just one man. Well, it wasn't just one man against God, it was an entire nation against God. But you'd have to read more than just Exodus 7 through 12 to get that. But it's an interesting idea, but yeah.
You know, one thing too, in the Old Testament, it was a physical, law of Moses was physical.
Mm-hmm.
You know, animal sacrifices. David was protecting those things that could have been sacrificed.
Oh, that's true too. That's a cool thought.
And then as Christians, we don't do that on animal sacrifice, but we do try to protect people's souls and lead them to Christ. So it's a little bit, it's different, but it's
Yeah, it's the same concept.
in concept, yeah.
And I think it's more than just the soul, which the soul is the ultimate thing, but think about what they can do for God in the kingdom if their soul were saved and they use their talents the way God had given them. I think that's a cool idea.
What would have been the action if, say, you had things to sacrifice, but you knew somebody was starving? What would your decision be?
I think in that case, God doesn't desire, it's not about giving sacrifice in the sense that, well, I've got to give something. No, when you help them, you did give something. You showed them mercy. What would God have? Your means just to show God, this is what I'm giving. Or God, you know I had something, but it was more fitting. Well, I don't know if the word more fitting. It was needful for me to give it to them, and God would understand that. It's interesting. Cool thoughts. Any other comments?
Things we give to God are not things God needs anyway.
Yeah, that's true, because
We use the things we give to God to bring souls to Him.
that's true.
Wasn't Jesus really talking about those that, I guess, put on the outer show of religion but didn't respect mercy?
Whitened sepulchres.
Mercy and kindness.
Yeah, I might do a sermon on that sometime soon. That's an interesting thought. Thank you for your time, comments, attention. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.